Welcome to another episode of the Scottish Property Podcast. My name's Nick Ponte. I'm here with my co-host Stephen Clark. How you doing, Stephen?
Good, Nick. How are you?
Oh, good. Thank you. Yeah, we've had a really good chat here around rent freezes and eviction bans. It's important that we bring the listeners up to date with all current affairs with property investing and landlording, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. It was a great chat. Today's guest is Brian Gilmour, isn't it, from Glasgow, Indigo
Square. They do residential lettings, factoring. He's got a lot of experience actually in the sector. We actually stole him off of Radio Scotland. So if you listen to the Kay Adams show in the morning, he does a fortnightly property slot where he takes questions and stuff from listeners. So he's used to doing that sort of thing. So today we were kind of chatting about the latest government announcements that came from Nicola Sturgeon about the rent increase freeze and eviction bans and how that's going to ultimately play out in a negative way for the whole sector. And, you know, it's me personally, I think it's going to damage renters worse in the long term than it will do landlords. Because as landlords, when our properties come up for rent, there's no cap, there's no limit on the increase that you can rent for. And what we're seeing at the moment is because of the supply shortage and this huge demand, then you can add on £200-300 onto the price of the property and still get unbelievable response. So I think it will have a stronger impact on the actual people that they're actually trying to help.
Well, but like we kind of chatted on a bit on the chat with Brian is, you know, politically, landlords are what make up 100,000 landlords in the UK versus 2.4 million people that are going to be voting. We're a minority, so if they piss us off, but they help the rental sector, or they seem to be doing a good thing, it's a politically good move for them. But yeah, we both think it's going to affect the market. So it's quite a nice chat to get kind of three people's opinions on it and talk about. What we should point out is there's no legislation being brought in at all on this yet, so we're kind of still in the dark. But you have another guest lined up for a week or so's time when hopefully more details have been released, haven't you?
Yeah, so we're just waiting for this legislation to come out. Then we'll get more details because so many questions coming in from landlords. You know, what happens with the rent increase notices that have just gone out, like prior to the 6th of September, that they take 3 months to come into effect? Like, we don't know. Like, we still don't know what happens to evictions that are currently ongoing or ones that are going through the tribunal. What's going to happen to them? So there's a lot of unanswered questions that we're waiting to get more detail on. As soon as we get the detail, we're trying to get John Blackwood on from the Scottish Association of Landlords to try and explain everything to you guys. So we'll line that up for future. But in the meantime, we're talking about all this stuff that's currently going on with Brian Gilmour, and I hope you enjoyed the interview, guys. We'll just cut straight to the interview with Brian. Okay, I'm delighted to welcome to the Scottish Property Podcast Brian Gilmour from Indigo. Indigo Lets or Indigo Property?
Indigo Square.
Indigo Square. Sorry.
Our website's indigolets.com.
And before we get on to today's topic, which is going to be all about rent freeze, eviction bans, all that stuff that landlords have been hearing about in the news, Brian, let us know a little bit about what you do and your company then.
Okay, so we are a property lettings and a property factor business. I personally have been in property for nearly 30 years. I ran the new homes for Countrywide and Slater Hogg for a period, and owned my particular insight into some of the issues we're about to talk about. I also owned a business that did what's called capital markets lending to housing associations. So that sort of bond finance at about £100 million plus. And I also am on the Kay Adams programme once a fortnight, taking calls about all property matters.
Great, we've stolen you from Radio Scotland then, so hopefully
yes.
They won't take. Hopefully, Kay won't take the huff.
The invoice is in the post.
Contact your agent.
Yes.
No, I mean, so you've got loads of great experience there, which we want to really tap into. Now, you know, I'm a landlord, as is Stephen here. We're all. Are you a landlord as well, Brian?
I am a landlord. Yeah, I've been a landlord for 19 years.
Okay.
So, which again is particularly relevant to what we'll get on to about people's perception of what the market is or isn't doing. And it's all, for me, it's whether you take a snapshot of 6 months or 60 years, changes your view on things.
Exactly. And I think if you are sitting here listening to this and you're a landlord, I think it's fair to say we've taken a bit of pounding over the last, well, I'd say probably since 2015 was the start where we really started taking a pounding. So bring us up to speed with Nicola Sturgeon's latest announcements, just in case any listeners who haven't been keeping up to date with the news. Just a quick, brief summary of what kind of she outlined there on the 6th of September, Brian.
Yeah, so on the 6th of September, Tuesday the 6th of September, Nicola Sturgeon in her statement for what the government's planning to do in the next business cycle said that there would be, from midnight that night, there would be a rent freeze and a moratorium on evictions, and that they would be bringing in emergency legislation to empower that. And the sector has been waiting since that announcement to find out exactly what that means and what that covers, because there's a myriad of questions that then generates, and we don't have the answers as of yet.
This is like a real knee-jerk approach to this, isn't it? Like, there was no legislation brought out, it was just announced and that was it, and it was as of effect almost immediately, wasn't it?
It was, and that's the thing about these types of things. So, as you say, there was no legislation. They will bring in emergency legislation, which will then be backdated to facilitate her announcement that it was from midnight that night. And as you say, it is, as you say, Stephen, it's a knee-jerk reaction to the headlines about the scarcity of properties available to rent, particularly in Glasgow and Edinburgh, and especially around just now, where we've got the huge influx of students looking for accommodation that compounds the problem. So it's a knee-jerk reaction to the news that there's no new properties available, which has been driving rents up, and the headline figures about what rents are doing in terms of going through. But of course, anybody who understands the market, and again, we'll probably touch on to this of my expectation of how little they understand the market. And this is not a political point, because Labour were also, so this is the Green Party were calling for a rent freeze, the SNP have enacted a rent freeze, and Labour were also requesting a rent freeze. This is not a political point, this is a criticism of people in power point, that they don't understand the market, because the headline figures about rent increases are driven by those very few properties, that 10% of the market that's been coming up for rent. So that new properties coming up for rent have seen landlords say, right, okay, well, I was getting 600, let's try 750 or 800. So yes, there's a huge jump that a property was getting 600, now getting 800.
It may have been 600 for the last 5, 6, 7, 8 years over that tenant was in without a rent increase.
Correct. And the other aspect is this is a rent freeze to protect existing tenants, but there is absolutely no evidence that existing tenants were suffering, in inverted commas, the same value of rent increases. Certainly from our lettings business perspective, we didn't have tenants who were getting 150, 200, 300 pound rent increases put on their properties.
What's the usual process for legislation like this that goes through? Because we had our Scottish Property Podcast networking events the day after this was announced, and there was an Iraqi gentleman in the group who's a landlord and has been a landlord for a long time in Scotland, and he referred to her as Saddam Sturgeon. It's obviously his point, not our points, but I thought it was very well received. His comment, obviously, being in the room full of 60 landlords, it was very well received. But what is the normal process for a legislation like this to be put in place?
Well, again, not to sound like someone who's a lecturer in politics, it's one of the downs. So ideally, what you do is you sit down with civil servants, you write legislation, and in most developed democracies, what you have is a revising chamber. So you might not necessarily, as I don't agree with the principle of an appointed House of Lords, but the principle, ignoring that the House of Lords is appointed for a minute, the principle of the House of Lords is that's what's called a revising chamber, so that legislation goes through that revising chamber to see if it works, if it's workable, if it conflicts with other legislation. So, of course, if you bring in emergency legislation, which is what they're going to do, now, to be fair to the Scottish Government, the death of the Queen has just put everything on hold for 10 days. So that's been a compounding issue. But no doubt they will be wanting to put some very, very brief legislation, very similar to what happened with COVID, that will go through the Scottish Parliament probably in the next 2 to 3 weeks, that will be very, very limited. It will be an amendment to the existing legislation that impacts on the private rented sector. And that legislation will say that there will be, under the following grounds, that there will be no rent increases to the end of March. And this is for all tenancies, public and private, which is a good headline grabber, because the public sector and it's to the end of March, and the public sector rent increases happen in April. So it's a good headline grabber to make it sound like we're not going after the private sector, it's everybody. But when the public sector aren't putting their rents up in the period that you cover, then it is only the private sector you're going after. So there's that aspect of it. But there's just so many questions about, as we know, as landlords will know, there are 18 grounds for eviction. Does this moratorium on eviction cover all 18 grounds, or is it just to do with rent arrears, and then various other things? But that legislation will no doubt come in the next couple of weeks, and it will be retroactive. So it will cover from, as the statement said, midnight that night, to prevent any rent increases or evictions. Yeah, and we'll get clarification as to what that actually means.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. There is so many unanswered questions, and that was one of the big kind of criticisms. That they just did this for a vote-winning exercise. Almost to take the limelight off of the new Prime Minister as well. The day before, I think she stepped up to make an announcement about the energy cap freeze as well. So there's so much politics at play here, but let's take it back to us as landlords then. In terms of the two things there, the rent increase freeze and the eviction ban, me personally, you guys will have your own thoughts as well. Interested to hear. The rent freeze thing doesn't really scare me too much. I'm not really bothered, to be honest with you. I don't really put my rents up anyway for long-staying tenants, although I was considering it now with all the the big inflation problem that we had. And everything else is going up. So insurance costs, factors, bills, everything. So I was actually considering a small increase, but I can cope with that. Even if interest rates are going up, I can deal with that. The eviction ban thing, that really doesn't sit well with me at all. It's fine if it's just a temporary thing, but I have this thing in my head that, that could, as a track record with Scottish Government, they do kind of keep extending things. They kept extending things during COVID. I've got a tenant at the moment, a non-paying tenant, going through the process of an application to the tribunal to get an eviction order. And, if already he's in like 4 or 5 months worth of arrears, if this eviction ban goes on and then extended, I could be potentially sitting a year, that's £6,000, £7,000 out of pocket. God knows how long it could go on for. So you guys, what's your view on the rent freeze and eviction ban? Which one are you more concerned about?
Well, for me, the eviction ban, and again, because you're right, most landlords that I know, okay, there are, as I always say, there are good landlords and there are bad landlords. There are good tenants, there are bad tenants, because strangely enough, there are good people and bad people out there in the world. So, but in general, most landlords will have a conversation about wanting to put rents up. And again, most landlords are aware that even in these buoyant times, if you evict a tenant to get a new tenant in, there will be a period where you do not get the revenue that you want to get from your property. So any period of losing a tenant can cost you money in terms of paying a letting agent and in terms of voids. So most landlords will say, I want to put the rent up by X, whatever that amount is, and we would then go to the tenant. If the tenant then turns around to us and says, I'm struggling to pay that, we would have the conversation with the landlord about the cost-benefit analysis of that, the cost of being out of pocket for trying to move forward with that tenant for refusing to put the rent up against the benefit of, this is a good tenant that you've had in place for years. Most landlords want a long-term tenant that doesn't cause them any hassle. So if you've got that, so you weigh that up. Additionally, legislation already exists to deal with rent rises that are too high, in that, one, a tenant can say, I don't want to pay that, and I'm going to go to the first-tier tribunal to assess as to whether that rent increase is fair or not. And secondly, they put legislation into facilities into legislation when they introduced the private rented tenancy for rental pressure zones for local authorities to apply and say rents in that area are becoming overheated, we need to cap them. Now, this gets back, Nick, to your earlier question about what will this legislation look like, because this is an example of badly written legislation, because the reason they can't do rental pressure zones is because the general consensus is the legislation was so poorly written that it would take a council about 5 years to pull together the sufficient evidence that they need to be able to justify bringing into place a rental pressure zone. So there's an example of badly written legislation not allowing them to do what they want. So then it comes to the evictions as to why I think evictions legislation and issue is, it is about thinking of the individual and not thinking of the bigger picture. So one, as we've talked about, is it all evictions or is it just rent arrears? Because if it's all evictions, what about if you rent out a property in a tenement block and you've got a ban pot for a tenant? What about the 7 other people who live in that tenement block who the landlord can't deal with the tenant because there's a ban on evictions if it's all evictions? What about the landlord who's lost his job and needs to sell his flat if it's all evictions? What about the landlord who's lost his job and needs to move back into his flat if it's all evictions? So there are so many questions. Does it affect all evictions, or is it only your circumstances just now? Is it only evictions for if it's just rent arrears? Is it only for people who get into rent arrears after the 6th of September? Because if it is, well, actually, again, it's a headline grabber because it takes about 4 to 6 months to enforce an eviction anyway. And so we'll be out of this moratorium period anyway. If it's, and in relation to rent arrears, rent rises, does it apply to all rent rises or is it just rent rises after 6th of September? If I noted somebody have a rent rise in July that was due to come into force on the 20th of September, is that paused or can that still go ahead? I mean, it's not just uncertainty for landlords, it's uncertainty for tenants as well. Is the tenant going to still have to go through with this rent rise? Is the tenant still going to have to go through with moving out because the landlord's selling the property? There are just so many questions. And the frustration is the Association of Residential Letting Agents met with the minister responsible for this on the Wednesday following the announcement, and they asked these questions, and the minister's answer was, I don't know, my civil servants are still working on it.
I also heard that was at the Arla or Property Mark, there was a Property Mark conference scheduled recently, and I think Patrick Harvey was supposed to be a speaker, and somebody posted on LinkedIn, looking forward to Patrick Harvey's speech, and it was just the empty lectern. He didn't turn up, apparently.
I'd kind of to touch on that as well. I agree with both of you on the rent freezes. We've spoken about this before, Nick, and Brian just touched on it there. If you do have a good tenant in place, you sit with that good tenant in place, and you don't generally, a lot of them won't put your rents up too much, because by the time you do check-ins, check-outs, remarket, and have a couple of week void period where you're responsible for the council tax and utilities, like you say, a little bit increase in the rent's not really worth that hundreds and hundreds of pounds that would take you to claw back, a long time to get back. So generally, I think most won't put them up. But what I'm finding now that it's changing, Matt, I don't like the power being taken away from me. So we spoke about this, Nick, where you were noticing a lot of rents going crazy and landlords want to push it because there was such huge demand. They were like, well, if we can push it an extra £200 or people off, an offers over type system, then why not? And we completely disagreed with it. But now, if that power is getting taken away from you to actually run your business how you see fit and put on a little increase up on it, if your interest rates go up or anything happens, that's making me now want to go, well, if I have a property become vacant, I'm going to maximize the rent now, and I'm going to flip and shoot as high as I can, because she's taking the power away from me to put up the rent if it doesn't work in my portfolio. So I think this kind of market interference, I think, kicks back in the negative way, and then it negatively impacts the people that they're trying to protect in the first place, which is the tenants, and they're the ones that are going to get hard done by it. So I don't, the rent freeze thing doesn't worry me, because like I think we've all touched on, as they've not done their kind of market research or understand the market, most landlords probably won't put up the rent, and especially over a winter period and stuff. So yeah, it is. It's the eviction ban that annoys me. I've got similar to you, Nick, a tenant that's not been paying since over a year now. They were to be evicted on the 6th of December last year. I didn't want to do it during Christmas. We've kind of agreed on some kind of payment plan to get them out and get them on a social housing. They've not got any stock. They can't get on the list, or they're not as high up on the list. So I'm now sitting with someone that's, in a hell of a lot of arrears. Now, if they catch wind of this ban on evictions and freeze on rent, do they just stop paying me for the next 6 months again? And then my arrears now probably surpass 10 grand. Like,
let's talk about that then. Like this idea that the fear that landlords have got at the moment that their tenants are going to find out and read the papers that they can't basically get chucked out of the property, rent freeze and all the rest of it. So from our experience, and I'm a letting agent as well, managed 160 properties. Like when the COVID struck and they introduced the emergency legislation, Brian, the last time, we didn't have any issues really of any non-paying tenants. What do you think is going to happen this time? Is it different? And what, from the tenants' point of view, do you think that there's going to be more people abusing this now?
I think it's well, you're right. I could have written when they brought it out with COVID, I could have written a list of 10 potential tenants who would have then said, I can't afford to pay my rent. And within 12 hours, 8 of the people that I would have put on that list contacted us and said, I can't afford to pay my rent. So there is an element of, if you're a letting agent, who those people are who will swing the lead and try and take advantage of it. And the majority of people will carry on as usual, which is again the reason for not needing this hammer to crack a nut aspect of it. I think the fear for many is that this was given in a this is what we're doing for now tone, but we're going to look at the whole of this in the long term to see what other steps we can do, or to see, and again, I think the fear for many is a lot of the things in COVID. So for example, landlords will know there used to be, there's 18 grounds for eviction, of which 6 used to be mandatory and 12 were discretionary. And during COVID, all 18 were changed to discretionary. And well, let's just keep it at that, was the attitude after COVID. So I think the fear is not necessarily that this has happened. You do always get the, I remember I was on Good Morning Scotland, and just the producers gave me a press release that a letting agent had just put out saying that this will stop landlords putting their properties up for rent and they'll just keep them vacant. I think there's sometimes there's a knee-jerk reaction of extreme fear with some of these things. But I think the concern of many is the direction of travel that this is indicating. That this is definitely indicating a dislike of the private rented sector, and this whole concept of private rented landlords are bad, they don't look after their properties, and we really need to get rid of them, which generates a whole load of other issues that I could then sit down and chat about in terms of, well, let's look at the social sector then.
Yeah, I mean, this whole thing, us against them, landlords against tenants, it just, like you say, it's been really, really unhelpful publicity from the government just announcing these. We've already, we always try to build good, positive relationships with tenants, try and do the best we can, make sure their maintenance repairs are done on time, they've got a safe, home, which is a good, livable standards. And then, our leader stepping up and just basically saying that, to stop your landlord shafting you this winter, we're basically going to protect you, because, she makes it sound like all landlords are just, like you say, just greedy, money-grabbing bastards.
It illustrates an ignorance of the sector as well, in that, right, okay, so to protect the tenant, I'm going to do this because, and again, so last Wednesday, or a week ago on Wednesday, I was on and we did a phone in on Radio Scotland, and it was quite marked. There was landlords phoning in, spitting feathers, and a lot of tenants phoning up saying, ha, 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 serves the money grabbing landlords right, because there's a perception that landlords are very, very wealthy and own all these properties for cash. So there's no understanding of how many landlords have these on buy-to-let mortgages. No understanding of how many are reluctant landlords. Roughly 70% of all landlords only own one property that they rent out. So these are not multiple property landlords. You know, from our bank of landlords that we deal with, a number of them, this is their retirement income. The ones who don't have buy-to-let mortgages that are older, this is their retirement income. So what you've got is, you've got costs going up for everybody. RPI is currently circa 10%, so everybody's costs going up 10%. I, as a letting agent, my income can't go up 10% because the rents aren't going up. So I either put my management fee up 10% to my landlords, which is a double whammy for landlords, or I sit there and swallow the 10% costs, which means I can't give a pay rise to staff, but I do give a pay rise to staff, so I take it from the magic money tree. Then there is the landlords themselves who've got 10% increases. They've got mortgage rates going up, buy-to-let mortgage rates increasing. They've got factors fees going up. They've got buildings insurance going up. And if I, as a letting agent, was to pass on our fees, they would have our fees going up. And those landlords who own them outright as part of pension planning, well, they've got their everyday life costs going up. And so the government have turned around to all of these other people and said, you've just got to swallow these cost of living charges. We as the government want to mitigate the cost of living crisis as much as we can for the punters. That's the general concept behind this. So the people who are going to pay for it are you private individuals over there. The state's not going to subsidise that. It's you private individuals that are going to subsidise it. That, for me, is one of the issues here. And then you make it sound like we're all in this together by saying it impacts on social housing providers. But as I mentioned earlier, they put their rents up in April. So this expires at the 31st of March. Mm-hmm. So they're exempt from this issue. So it's private landlords who, whatever sector they're in, and letting agents, they're seeing their costs go up at the RPI with everybody else, and they have no ability to pass even a bit of that on, even a third of that on. They cannot pass that on to tenants.
Yeah, and let's just set a bit of backdrop to this as well, because like already the Greens and the SNP basically got together and there was the New Deal for Tenants consultation that has been and gone now. I think that's closed, and so this is their way of making it more fairer for tenants. And there was quite a lot of talk in there about obviously rent controls in the New Deal for Tenants. So I think a lot of the worry as well is that this is going to fast track this. I mean, this was probably going to come anyway, but we were talking about 2024 to 2025, quite a long time away. But now with this cost of living crisis, there's even more of an argument that they need to act faster and get these rent controls in place. So I guess my next question would be, you know, like, I know we've not got a crystal ball and we can't foresee the future, but, you know, do you think there's an element of come the end of March 2023, they're not going to just be able to drop this? You know, the cost of living crisis is not going to be away. Gas and electric prices could be here for another 2 years. You know, they're going to need to look at some sort of long-term measure that they're going to need to introduce. What do you think?
Well, again, so my perception as to what's happening here is the 6-month window that they're talking about is just to give them breathing space. We've paused rents, we've paused evictions. That gives us 6 months to have a look under the bonnet and decide what other more detailed things we can do from April 2023 onwards. That's what I think this is all around. Yeah, I agree. And again, it gets back to, I talked earlier about a company I used to own. We were a capital markets funder for housing associations. I remember I sat in a room with the chief executive of a housing association who said there is no such thing as a good private landlord. So that is an attitude that exists in the social housing world. Now, the biggest reason we've got this problem today in the rental market, and there is a rental price increase happening, the biggest reason we've got that is because of supply and demand. So we have a lack of supply of housing. And so then you have to look at, well, where could we get that supply of housing from? Well, the social housing sector, they have built, on average, in each of the last 4 years, they've averaged 5,133 properties a year in each of the last 4 years. We've got 160,000 people on social housing, affordable housing waiting lists. So we've got 5,000 people on affordable housing waiting lists. Now, some of that's double counting because people are on different waiting lists for different housing associations. But even if it's double counting that takes 60,000 off that, you still have 100,000 people. And if we are building 5,100 affordable homes a year, then you can see where the problem lies. And this is that, for me, every economic issue that we've got at the moment in the UK is a consequence of 10 to 20 years of governments, UK and Scottish, so all political hues. So this is definitely not a political point, because all political parties have been involved in this, kicking the can down the road of major decision making. Yeah. And what we've done, where we are just now, we've reached the culmination of, you kick the can down the roads, you can't kick it any further down the road. So we've got an energy. I remember having a consultant who worked for my last company who was on a government committee that was called Energy 2020. And the reason the committee was called Energy 2020, because when it was set up in year 2000, that was the year we would have an energy crisis in the UK in 2020. So here we are in 2022 with an energy crisis. So the can's been kicked down the road on energy for 20 years, and it's culminated in where we are just now. Housing, I sat in a room with two of Scotland's most senior housing civil servants. And I said, look, we've been working on this financial model here, doing something else. But in the course of that, we found a way that we believe that you could build more social housing for the same amount of money. And the civil servant said, sorry, Brian, why would we want to do that? And I said, oh, right, okay. I thought to myself, obviously worded this the wrong way. And I said, right, okay, you could build the same amount of social housing for less money. No, I'm sorry, Brian, I'm missing the point. Why would we want to do that? We've set ourselves a target. We are going to just beat that target. We don't want to blitz the target. We just want to just make it. We just want to just overachieve, and that's what we're going to do. So that was 6-7 years ago, that conversation. So that was a 5-year target. So for the last 12 years at least, we have had modelling and targeting for the number of social houses and affordable houses that are built in Scotland that are based on an arbitrary figure that the civil servants have set that is achievable at the end of 5 years. And that is where the crux of this whole issue comes from. We have not built enough affordable housing. That's why the private rented sector has grown from around 6% of the housing stock in Scotland at the millennium to 14% of the housing stock. Now, if you politically don't like the idea of private landlords, fine. That's a reasonable political position to be in, to say we don't think private land. You know, if I mentioned earlier about 70% of private landlords only own one property. So if you take the attitude of those people are not best equipped to be landlords in the long term, if for people, for their long-term housing needs, a guy who only owns one property, you know, a slight change in his personal financial circumstances could make it impossible for him to maintain that property. That's not healthy for your housing stock. That's a reasonable political position to be in. And what we want to do is set up circumstances that it's only bigger companies that can afford to be in the private rented sector who are doing it for a living. That is a reasonable political position to be in. If you're going to take that position and you want to reduce the privates, and the consequence of doing that would be reducing the private sector from the 14% of your housing stock back down to the 6%, how are you going to bridge that 8% gap? That is the issue. And how are you going to fund that 8% gap? Because that 8% gap and taking 120,000 people off affordable housing waiting lists will cost 30 to 50 billion pounds, which the Scottish budget, from what I understand, the Scottish government budget is about 35 billion pounds. So we would be spending nothing on anything bar housing.
Yeah, and it seems so easy to solve, doesn't it? You just build more houses. And that is the bottom line. It's the supply shortage. And they can find 180 billion pounds to basically fund this energy crisis, but they can't build more houses, and the planning restrictions as well that we're facing. That's probably an argument for another day. Talking about the current supply shortage and this huge supply-demand imbalance at the moment that we are seeing all over Scotland and all Scottish cities. I think this is happening, especially in Glasgow where I am. Rents are up. I think Zoopla put out some figures there recently, 14.4% over the year. I know myself through re-advertising properties, the demand that we're getting is off the scale for anything in desirable locations to stay, especially like the West End, South Side. You're talking about hundreds and hundreds of people who are desperate for accommodation. It's getting quite sad. We've got parents of university students phoning up, pleading, what is it can we do? Can we give you more rent? Can we pay you more? Can we give you a year up front in advance? We're not even allowed to take a year's rent up front in advance. People are so desperate. What are you seeing yourself? The big chat is the big argument, obviously, against all this, that all these landlords are going to sell up, and they've had enough. Enough's enough. It just doesn't make sense anymore to buy to let. This is an argument that you hear time and time again. We want to know, are you seeing this landlords selling up? What are you seeing with rents at the moment as well?
Well, in terms of your comment there about the volume of inquiries, we now put stuff up for about 2-3 hours and then take it off because we cannot cope. What will happen is our email system will then be completely full. We'll get 200-300 emails in that 2-3 hour window. Then we'll start getting our phone system crashing because the people are phoning up because we've not answered their emails. And then the email situation is compounded because people are emailing because I phoned in and I emailed in and nobody's get back to me. So you literally cannot cope with it. So those are the challenges of it. You're right. Not necessarily seen landlords. I mean, it is all very quick.
Yeah.
It's only 10 days ago, so I've not necessarily seen landlords wanting to get out. Ironically, an eviction moratorium compounds your problem because you then can't free up stock of the people who are withholding rent or not paying rent or whatever. So it's actually more difficult to free up stock. So you're actually compounding the problem with that by having a rental moratorium in it. So there is no short-term fix for it. I mean, as you say, just build more houses. Well, if I decide to build a block of flats tomorrow, it's 2 years down the line, so there's no fix. Persuade tenants to live further afield. Well, right, okay, let's build some more trains and buy some more buses with better bus, commuting routes. There is no quick fix to the issue. One of the times when I checked into, when I think it was when COP26 was on in Glasgow, I always remember putting in, just typing the words Glasgow, which encompasses, for people who don't know the city of Glasgow, encompasses areas which are not technically the city of Glasgow. So it's the area that about 1 million people live within. And I just put £1,000. And there was 23 properties came up on one of the main search engines, properties for rent under £1,000 within Glasgow. So there is no quick fix. And of course, again, the other compounding issue that might have been at play here is because the sales market has been so well. I think you have had some of those reluctant landlords. The housing sales market in Scotland crashed in 2008. The average house price in Scotland didn't recover to 2008 levels until 2018. So you had a lot of people who rented properties out in that 10-year window because they had no other option, suddenly could get their money back. So you did have a section of, I think actually the most recent statistics show that the percentage of housing stock which is private rented has gone back about 1.5% in Scotland in the last 2 years. So a section's gone out. And then the other thing is short-term lets, the likes of Airbnb. So in Edinburgh, 5 years ago, 24% of the housing stock in Edinburgh was private rented sector. And now 22% of the housing stock in Edinburgh is private rented sector. And the numbers of properties in the short-term let sector has gone up at exactly the same rate that the private sector has come back. Because in places like Edinburgh, landlords have looked and thought, I can make the same amount of money in 1 month that I could make in a full year in the private rented sector. Plus, I don't have all the legislation in terms of fire safety, in terms of gas safety certification, the new smoke and heat alarms that affects every residential property, they will impact that. But previously, I didn't need all the smoke alarms and heat alarms. There was less legislation. So one way that they could quickly deal, instead of attacking the private rented sector, one way that might put a few hundred properties in Glasgow and a few hundred properties in Edinburgh and a few hundred properties in Dundee back into the private rented sector would be to quickly put restrictions on the short-term let market. Certainly in Edinburgh, you could easily see 200-300 properties come out of Airbnb and back onto the long-term let. Now, as you and I have just mentioned, Nick, about the number of inquiries you get when you put a property up for rent, just sticking in the space of a 1-2 month window, sticking an extra 200 properties in Edinburgh or Glasgow into that sector would just cool things off just sufficiently to take the edge off things.
So this might happen with this new legislation coming in October, I think it is, for the service accommodation sector to get their planning approved. Is it Nick? I can't remember.
I think it's Edinburgh. They've got the planning process, but I think in all the other local authorities, I think they're just asking for you to get a license. Is that right, Brian?
Well, actually, Glasgow introduced a bylaw in 2017 that effectively means you cannot have a short-term let in a building with a communal entrance for more than 6 months. If you do it for more than 6 months a year, it's okay. You can do it for, I'm going away for a long weekend and you can live in my flat, etc. But if you do it as a permanent business thing, Glasgow actually introduced a bylaw in 2017. However, they are not proactively policing that bylaw and they're not advertising the bylaw because they don't have the staff. But there have been 2 court cases of landlords having being told that you cannot have a short-term let in your property because of that. So again, it gets back to, there are some tools out there. You don't need, you don't need the hammer of this announcement from Nicola Sturgeon. You just, to take the heat out of this at the margins, you just need to implement some of the tools that they've already got. But you're right, Stephen. There is hope that the licensing legislation they brought in Edinburgh might have an impact there, and we might start to see some movement back from the short-term let sector to the long-term.
What do you think this effect's going to happen? So taking a bigger picture, like you touched on there, Brian, that, okay, I take a snapshot of 6 months or the last couple of years for the private rental sector, a bit doom and gloom, but take this view over the last 15, 20 years and where you think it's going. What's your thoughts on this kind of political agenda, and where do you think it'll push the private rental sector?
Well, one, I always like taking a longer term view, getting back to, at the moment, in the last 2 years when people have been talking about how the sales market in Scotland's been growing crazy and it's not being sustainable. I always say, yes, if you look in a 2-year window, that's the case. But if you look in the 14-year window from 2008, well, it didn't move from 2008 to 2018. So actually the percentage rise in the last 2 years. And it's the same with rentals. I can remember selling, I don't know why, sometimes certain properties stick in your head. I remember selling a guy's flat in 2005. And he was selling it because he'd been rented out and he was fed up because for the last 10 years, he'd been getting £400 a month for that property. And that was from 95 to 2005, he'd been getting £400 a month. He bought it in 1990 and was getting £450 a month. He was getting £450 a month from 1990 to 1995, and then from 95 to 2000, he was getting 400. And you know what? Knowing that property, it probably stayed at £400 a month from 2005 to 2015. And that's one of the things when people look at, when politicians do knee-jerk reaction things and look in the last 6 months, that flat is probably now 600 a month. But for a good 20 years, it probably never moved a penny in rent, because getting back to demand and supply, because from 2005, certainly to 2008, or certainly from 95 to 2008, it was really easy for people to get mortgages. And so rental market didn't perform so well. Rents didn't really move that much. If you look back historically, Nick, you've mentioned Glasgow. Glasgow, for the majority of the period prior to 2015, rents in Glasgow rose annually at a rate below the rate of inflation for the previous 15, 20 years. So if you look at that, rents didn't move. So that's an indication of it's all about supply and demand. People could get mortgages back there. But Stephen, getting back to the crux of your question, the direction of travel here, patently from the Greens, from the SNP, from Labour, is all about control of the private rented market. We stopped getting newer landlords when it was, again, this is not a political point. George Osborne, in his last budget that affected Scottish taxpayers, it was George Osborne who brought in the principle of the additional dwelling supplement on stamp duty. It was 3%. He brought it in. 6 months later, the Scottish government got responsibility for stamp duty, changed it to land and building transaction tax, and brought in the same thing. So buying a second property costs now an additional 4%. So that's an impediment to new landlords coming into the sector. So we've already had that for 8, 9 years, preventing new landlords coming into the sector because of the additional tax and the additional costs. So I can see that as a political plan to ensure that it's only people who've got deep enough pockets to become landlords. You can see that. And then these other steps. Everything for me is about a direction of travel towards heavy restrictions on the private landlords. And that's because
the smaller ones, like, yeah, a lot of the things you mentioned kind of pointed towards the direction of corporations owning it. You didn't touch on clause 24 kind of tax changes coming into place. That would obviously indicate another push towards corporates owning the majority of the private rental sector. And then obviously, like I think you mentioned, I think you said 70% of the Scottish landlords only have one property and they're kind of accidental landlords. So if that takes away the amateurs or the one that can't maintain or they can't afford to maintain their property, but the companies could, if you would that be a fair point? I think
they're looking at models like Germany and Austria, and actually in Switzerland. Switzerland's got one of the lowest owner occupancy rates in the world of property. I always remember my economics lecturer at university he used to go on his holidays to East Germany, pointing out that Switzerland had one of the lowest owner occupancy rates and Bangladesh had one of the highest owner occupancy rates of properties in the world. That was always his big thing to point out.
That's quite an interesting fact, actually.
I mean, the argument is it gives you a more mobile workforce because they can move around and they're not tied into assets. So if you're looking at your housing stock tenure, and pretty much Scotland has plateaued out, we're around 60% of us own our own home and the other 40% rent. And that's now been the case for a good 20 years or so. So if you think that's plateauing out, then you are having, for the foreseeable future, 40% of your population are going to live in rented accommodation. So if you've got that, you're not going to fix it by flipping all those people into the social rented sector because in the state funded sector, because you just can't afford that. So then if you are going to have a chunk of your sector being the private rented sector, you look at continental Europe, where principally that is corporations and not really a cottage industry, for want of a better way of putting it, in terms of individuals. That for me is the indication of where we're heading for the private rented sector. It's never going to be an overnight change and you're not going to quickly get rid of people, but I think that's the long-term goal.
Yeah, and that brings us on to the build to rent developments that you see, some of which are going up, like I've seen in Glasgow. You're talking about, £200 million developments and stuff, 700 flats and stuff. Now, I read an article yesterday that a lot of the investment for that, and, we're talking about pension funds and institutional investors and stuff like that. A lot of them have seen this news and be like, wait a minute, what's going on here in Scotland? Do we want to invest up there anymore? Some of these schemes that are in the pipeline and planning, are they just going to be like, no way, that's just far too risky, the attitudes that they've got up there. We'll just go safe and go in Manchester or Liverpool or that. Does that deter investment? What do you think is going to happen there?
Well, again, you've got to look at it without a simplistic hat on. So when private landlords are criticised for the rents that they charge, well, there's a risk associated with being a private landlord, whether you're a corporation or a private individual. Safest thing to do is stick your money in the bank of the building society. £85,000 of that's protected. It's nice and safe, but your interest is rubbish, right? So the greater your risk, the higher the return you want on your investment to mitigate against that risk. So as a private landlord, I've got the value of the asset and the rent that I charge against that. And the rent is set based on a yield or return on that investment. And that is based upon the fact that, one, I am responsible for all the repairs. So we do property factoring. Last September, we took over a building on a Saturday night, and on the Monday, I got a phone call from Glasgow City Council. You factor a building? Yes, we took over on Saturday. Well, a chunk of the rendering's just fallen off and hit the house next door. You need to sort this out. There's 150 grand repair that then came out of nowhere to hit those owners. 18.5 grand an owner. 2 of the owners were private landlords. The tenants, unaffected by the render coming off because the building's not shut down, the landlord has got this unexpected cost coming in. So there's the benefit of renting out is you don't have those charges. The risk for a landlord, you do. So your risk and reward element as to where rents are set is partly impacted by that. So the big institutions that you mentioned, the pension funds, the likes of Standard Life and Legal and General and all these types of people, they're investing hundreds of billions of pounds of our money, our pension money, although many private landlords, your pension is your property, but our pension money is being invested. They need to protect that. They need to have the proper return. UK government 30-year money at the moment, in terms of if I was a financial institution, the safest thing I can do is buy a British government bond. And a British government 30-year money bond is about 3.8, 3.9%, just under 4%. So the safest thing as a pension fund that I can do is buy a British government 30-year bond at 4%. So if I then go and do anything other than that, my risk is going up on that investment, so my percentage return needs to go up. So if I then have, in Scotland, somebody turning around and saying, we, the state, are going to determine what your return is, I'm going to have second thoughts about making that investment. That is one of the things, if you're wanting to move to that private rented sector that's done by big corporations, that is one of the things you need to consider. As you quite rightly say, Nick, what is the potential impact on that buy-to-let proposition? Because they are going to be wanting. So if I'm building, if it costs me 150 grand to build a 2-bedroom flat, which is probably the bare minimum that it will cost them with all the charges, then I am wanting, as an absolute minimum, I'm wanting 8-9 grand a year back out of that as an institutional investor. So I'm wanting £700 a month, £600-700 a month out of that investment to make it worthwhile for me to do that.
Absolutely. And, the thing is, governments meddling in, free market economies and, just those restrictions in the market, it's never going to end well. I mean, it's like you say, the return invest, right? I've got like a portfolio of 12 flats, right? I've got this one non-payer. That's the risk. I'm comfortable with the risk, right? Or I was comfortable with the risk because I can factor in a 6 to 8 month of a non-paying tenant, but I do have the ability there to eventually get the eviction. That's been removed now. That's gone from 6 to 8 months to 12 months plus, who knows? So it really starts impacting, like you say, return. If you're running it as investment business, which most portfolio landlords, once they get past 5 or 6 properties, you're really looking at the numbers. Then it's definitely definitely a fear I've got for sure. Let's try and end on a positive note. Is property still a good way to invest for
for the long term?
For the long term, 20 years, those people who want to put some money away for help themselves out in their retirement, pass on to their kids, that sort of thing. I was going to say, let's end that positive note, but I don't know if this will.
No, it is a positive. If you go and look average house prices in Scotland since the war, and you take any 10 years up to 2008, and I'll talk about that in a minute, you take any 10 years, your asset will have minimum doubled in value, minimum. You just go back and look, any 10-year period since the war, properties have doubled in value. Now, my own gut feel is that exponential doubling in value, and between 2008 2018, it didn't, right? But if I had 100 grand, because that's easy for me to do, maths on the top of my head, speaking to you just now, if I take 100 grand, the worst in between now and the war, the worst period was 2008 to 2018. If I take my 100 grand in March 2008, it would have only been worth 100 grand in March 2018. That's the worst I would have had. But I still had the rental yield return on that 100 grand during that time, and the rental yield would have been somewhere between 6 and 12%. That's about the norm. If I'd have taken that and put it in the building society during that time, I would have put my 100 grand in, still into 100 grand at the end of it, and I'd have been getting 1.5% yield on that. So as that's one side of it. Excluding that 2008 to 2018, any other time, I'd put my 100 grand in property at the end of 10 years, I would have got double, I would have got 200 grand back. Plus, I would have been getting my rental yield in the middle period. Now, I think we're at the end of that doubling in value bit because there was various reasons. There was, only the husband used to work, and then the woman started to work, and then we changed credit facilities and all that type of thing. There's a whole lot of explanations as to why we were able to double property values. All of that has stopped, but it's still, you put your money in property, and it is a far better return than stick it in a bank or building society, because unless you put it somewhere with a dreadful, but most people would be able to see if you walk down a crappy street, maybe that's not a place to buy a property. Most people will go and will know the areas, know around them. If you invest in property, the worst that will happen is the value of the asset stops rising. Well, that's what would happen if you stuck it in the building society anyway. Property always outperforms other forms of investment.
Love it. We will end on that note, because I want to end for the listeners. I want to end on a positive note. I think it's been a great chat. Thanks so much for your time, Brian. A lot of experience we need to tap into, possibly in other episodes if we could get you back in the future.
No worries.
And really appreciate your time. Where can people reach out to you if they want to get in touch for any of your services? Like, what can you offer people?
Well, we do factoring of buildings, which is common repairs. It's obviously newer buildings in Edinburgh, older, all types of buildings in Glasgow. It tends to be tenements in Edinburgh tend to be unfactored, which is not the best thing. So you can just go to our website, indigolets.com, or you can email me, Brian.
So I hope you managed to learn something from all that information. Stephen, what have we got happening?
Well, we have our Scottish Property Podcast Ball on Saturday the 3rd of December. We've got tables filling up from companies that are supporting it. So it's really good to welcome these guys on board. It's going to be a great night out. And we've also got our Scottish Property Podcast monthly networking events on the first Wednesday of every month in cities throughout Scotland.
Absolutely, go and book your place. Really looking forward to this Christmas ball. Already we've got a few like office groups, office parties, booking tables, and everybody in the property sector, not just investors. If you're estate agents, accountants, mortgage brokers, all that, get yourself in touch and we will sort you out with the tickets. Tickets are £95. Thanks again for listening, guys. Tag us on social media and we'll speak to you again next week.
Thanks a lot, guys.